1 million social housing units by 2032. That's the goal Taiwan set for itself 3 years ago. High real estate prices and sluggish real wage growth are not just a problem here, but in many places around the world. While countries like the United Kingdom have a long history of building and operating social housing, Taiwan has only recently started catching up. Arguably, the biggest factor behind the need for public housing in Taiwan is real estate affordability. According to Numbeo, the median price of an apartment in Taipei amounts to 33 years of a median household income and 25 years on average in the entire country. Those numbers are 15 and 8 for London and all of United Kingdom respectively. With that in mind, let's look at public housing stock. The UK has over 4 million homes available for rent under its public housing schemes, while Taiwan reports a total of just under 42,000 units. Chantalle, what are the differences that you see here between social, affordable, public, in both how those words are used and in policies behind them?
I would say that in Taiwan, historically, affordable housing has been mostly been used in the narrow conception as affordability just in rental price or in housing price. And of course, if we look back at history, had this national housing, which was constructed by the government, funded by the government, but was for ownership. But with the introduction of the new sort of part of the affordable housing policy, which is the social rental housing policy, I think they were specifically looking for a new term to coin the social housing rental policy and to see how is it different than the previous projects like the national housing or just the subsidies for low-income families.
The Taiwanese government did set a goal for itself to add 1 million so-called social housing units by 2032. Can you tell us what's behind this policy? Are we actually talking about public housing constructed and run by the government, or are there other options on the table?
Yeah, it's basically a dual approach. So what you see is that there is a heavy emphasis on the rental subsidies, which is not only for the people living in the social rental housing, but also for people living in the private market as well. The construction of the social housing, like I mentioned, is quite hard in certain inner city areas because of the limited available land and the regeneration or urban renewal that's very hard due to the private ownership of the land. So what we see is that the emphasis on the rental subsidies has sort of taken over and is becoming a more important component for the government to support not only low-income families, but also middle-class families.
42,000 doesn't sound like a whole lot. So how far away is that from what is actually needed in Taiwan?
Well, actually, when the social rental housing policy started in 2016, we actually only had less than 1% of public or social rental housing in Taiwan. So the current number that you mentioned is actually already much higher. It's, I think, around 2 or 3% of the total housing stock. So in terms of what is needed, I would say much more. I cannot provide you a specific number. But yeah, we can compare with other countries and then we can see that a larger part of the total housing stock would be allocated as social housing.
Well, I want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier, the security that people like about participating in this social housing scheme in Taiwan. Many of these programs are capped to a certain number of years. So why are they still considered secure?
This is a very good question, and it really has to do with Taiwan's protection of tenant protection, which is almost absent. The landlord can basically tell you overnight you have to leave the apartment because it's considered a private property and there's no laws protecting tenants. Traditionally, Taiwan's private rental market has been very much like a black box. We don't know what's going on because either there was in a homeowner society, rental was basically not really perceived as an option. So in this sense, the government is perceived as a more secure provider of rental housing, as there will be a longer duration of the contract, even though it's limited or capped to 6 or 12 years, depending on the situation of the household. But still, the government is just more considered as a trustworthy landlord.
Why do certain municipalities in Taiwan opt to use these kind of quotas to fulfill, perhaps other policy objectives rather than just focusing on providing affordable accommodation.
Yes, I think this also goes back to the perception of social rental housing in Taiwan. And it's a specific framing that we actually see from the beginning of the initiation of the social housing policy, is that social housing has been framed as for young people to temporarily have a stable living situation where after they can still afford to buy a property. They can save their money while living in the social housing, and then they can still have the sort of like culturally responsible thing that they have to do is you have to own a house in Taiwan. The current framing is a continuation of what we actually saw in the previous 10 years, to see how the social housing can be portrayed as something beneficial, not harming the interests of homeowners themselves. So we don't have to focus too much on really changing the housing market. We just provide some temporarily living place for certain groups in society that is basically accepted by everyone. So in contrast to having a politically very unfavorable method, which would be increasing the housing tax or the multiple housing tax. So in that sense, I think it's really bringing together how the housing market is part of Taiwanese society in relation to what is the biggest issue perceived in the country at this moment.